The logic seems flawless to him. It seems flawless to his generals. France is gone. Britain stands alone. Surely, they think, Britain will sue for peace. Surely no nation can withstand the combined weight of the German army and Luftwaffe. The conversation in those rooms that July is not whether Britain will fall, but when, and how quickly the Wehrmacht can reorganize for the next campaign, perhaps into the Soviet Union by autumn. No one in that room understands what they have actually defeated. No one grasps what they have actually preserved. We know the details of these meetings from the war diary of General Franz Halder, Chief of the General Staff of the German Army, archived at the Militärgeschichtliches Forschungsamt in Freiburg. His entries from late June and early July 1940 reveal the confidence, the almost casual certainty, that victory in the West meant victory in the war itself. Halder writes in precise, clipped prose. He records Hitler's decisions. He notes the concerns of subordinates. And nowhere in those pages, does he record a serious analysis of British supply capacity, British industrial production, or the mechanisms by which Britain might sustain a prolonged war of attrition. That blindness will cost millions of lives. What the German High Command failed to grasp in those July days was this: they had not defeated Britain's capacity to wage war. They had only defeated Britain's army on the continent. Britain's factories were intact. Britain's access to raw materials, Canadian wheat, Australian metals, American industrial potential, was about to expand, not contract. And Britain's navy, though damaged in France, still controlled the waters around the British Isles. What Germany had actually accomplished was to eliminate the one theatre where Britain might have been forced to deploy its forces in a way that exhausted them. Now Britain could concentrate on what it did best, projecting power through logistics and industrial production rather than through manpower. The mystery that defines this entire war, the mystery that will occupy us across these chapters, is not why Germany lost, but why German officers, many of them brilliant strategists, never saw the mathematical inevitability of that loss. How could men of such tactical skill miss a calculation so fundamental? The answer lies in a single word: logistics. Not strategy, not tactics, not generalship in any form that military academies teach, but the unglamorous, meticulous discipline of moving food, ammunition, fuel, and spare parts across space and time. In July 1940, no German general believed that logistics could defeat them. They would spend the next 5 years learning otherwise. In the summer of 1940, while German generals celebrated their victory over France, British aircraft production was accelerating toward numbers that should have terrified Berlin. We know this from the Air Ministry production returns, archived in the Public Record Office under AIR 2 series, now held at the National Archives in Kew. These documents record, month by month, the precise number of aircraft manufactured in British factories. They are dry, factual, devastating. By September 1940, at the height of the Battle of Britain, British aircraft plants were producing 476 fighter aircraft every month. Every single month. The same reports, cross-checked against German production figures held in the Speer Armaments Ministry records now archived at the Institut für Zeitgeschichte in Munich, show that Germany was producing approximately 250 fighters per month. Germany was being outproduced by nearly 2 to 1, and the gap was widening, not closing. Yet German intelligence insisted otherwise. The Abwehr reports on British production, declassified and now studied by historians like R.V. Jones, who documented his work in his 1978 memoir, Most Secret War, repeatedly underestimated British output. German spies reported that British factories were being saturated by RAF demand, that production was plateauing, that attrition in the Luftwaffe was outpacing British replacement capacity. The reports were confident. They were also catastrophically wrong. How we know this? The RAF operational records books, held at the National Archives under AIR 24 series, record every aircraft loss and every aircraft received by operational squadrons. Cross-referenced with Ministry of Aircraft production figures, they create an irrefutable timeline. In July 1940, the RAF had approximately 950 operational fighters. By October, despite sustained Luftwaffe attacks, that number had actually increased to 1,060. The Germans were losing the attrition war not because British pilots were better, though they were flying over home territory and could bail out and be recovered, but because British factories were replenishing the RAF faster than the Luftwaffe could destroy it. This was not a tactical victory. This was a logistical collapse, and it was happening on the German side. The German General Staff failed to understand a single crucial principle. Aircraft production is not an isolated phenomenon. It is a system. It requires raw materials, skilled workers, electricity, machine tools, fuel for transportation, factory floor space, coordinated supply chains for components. British logistics had constructed this system over decades. The Air Ministry's production returns show that this system could absorb losses, recover from bombing damage to factories, and actually accelerate output during wartime. German intelligence never truly grasped the complexity of what they were observing. They saw aircraft losses and assumed British capacity was finite. They did not see the supply chain, and therefore they did not understand why their assumptions were false. By the time the Battle of Britain ended in October 1940, this logistical inequality had already decided the outcome. The Luftwaffe had lost approximately 1,650 aircraft. The RAF had lost 915. The mathematics seemed even, almost balanced, but those numbers conceal the deeper truth. Every Luftwaffe aircraft lost represented a pilot trained at enormous expense over months, represented hours of German production that could not be replaced at the rate needed. Every RAF aircraft lost represented a machine that could be replaced within weeks by the production system that continued, relentlessly, to turn out fighters. The Germans saw a battle. History would recognize it as the visible manifestation of a logistical crisis they could never solve. We know the precise operational tempo of the U-boat war from Admiral Dönitz's personal war diary, held at the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv in Freiburg. His entries detail every patrol, every sinking, every loss of a U-boat. He calculates constantly how many merchant vessels must be sunk to reduce British stocks below survival levels. What is the tonnage rate? What is the replacement rate? Dönitz believed with an intensity that bordered on obsession, that if Germany could sink more than 300,000 tons of shipping per month, Britain would be forced to surrender by starvation and lack of raw materials within 18 months. The numbers were almost right. Almost. We know from British Admiralty war diaries held at the National Archives under ADM 205 series that by 1942, German U-boats were indeed sinking merchant vessels at catastrophic rates. In November 1942, the Allies lost over 760,000 tons of shipping to German submarines and surface raiders. Britain's food stocks had fallen to a 9-week supply. 9 weeks. If that rate of sinking had continued for another year, Britain would genuinely have faced starvation. The mathematics of starvation is not theoretical. It is lethal. It is absolute. But the German strategy contained a fatal flaw, and that flaw was logistical. How we know this? Captured German supply manifests and U-boat construction records, now held at the National Archives and Records Administration in College Park, Maryland, under RG 226, show that Germany could not build replacement U-boats faster than they were being sunk once Allied countermeasures began taking effect. In 1940, Germany produced 26 U-boats. In 1941, 64 U-boats. In 1942, 182 U-boats. The production was accelerating, but so was the attrition. U-boat losses in 1940 were 4. In 1941, 35. By 1942, 86 U-boats were lost to enemy action. By 1943, 84 U-boats were being sunk every month. Each U-boat required approximately 10 months to construct. Each U-boat required months of crew training. Each U-boat lost meant that months of German production, German steel, German precision engineering, and trained German personnel were simply gone. Unlike Britain, which could replace convoy losses through American production under the Lend-Lease program, Germany had no external source of replacement U-boats. Germany had only German shipyards, German steel, and German manpower. The submarine war became, inevitably, a war of attrition that Germany could not win. Dönitz never fully accepted this. His diary entries from late 1942 show a man who continues to believe that one more push, one more wave of U-boats, will break British resistance. It never comes. The convoys keep getting through. The escort vessels keep getting better. Long-range aircraft, equipped with radar derived from the radio direction finding apparatus, documented in R.V. Jones's papers at Churchill College, Cambridge, begin hunting U-boats with lethal efficiency. By 1943, the U-boats are no longer a war-winning weapon. They have become, instead, a drain on German resources that cannot be replenished. Britain survives not through superior seamanship or superior tactics, though both existed. Britain survives because the British logistical system, the convoy system, the repair facilities, the American shipbuilding, the rationing system that the Ministry of Food records show stretched food supplies across the entire population, was more robust, more resilient, and more replaceable than the German U-boat force. But paper and reality have begun to diverge. The operational planning for Operation Sea Lion is documented in the OKH, Oberkommando des Heers, planning documents, held at the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv. These documents reveal a fundamental contradiction in German strategic thinking. The army needed to transport 100,000 troops across the Channel and land them on a hostile coast. The Navy insisted it could not guarantee protection for such a crossing, given British naval superiority in the English Channel. The Luftwaffe promised to provide air cover, but the Luftwaffe was simultaneously being depleted in its campaign against the RAF. There was no consensus. There was no unified logistical plan. Admiral Erich Raeder, commander of the Kriegsmarine, met repeatedly with Hitler to discuss Sea Lion. These meetings are documented in the conference notes held at the Institute for Zeitgeschichte in Munich. Raeder was, by the accounts of officers present, deeply skeptical. The Kriegsmarine did not have the transport capacity. The Kriegsmarine did not have the firepower to defend against British naval intervention. The Kriegsmarine did not have the fuel reserves to maintain such an operation. Every meeting ended with the same conclusion. Sea Lion was logistically possible only if the Luftwaffe could completely neutralize British air power, and the Luftwaffe could do no such thing. How we know this? The requisitioned vessels used in Sea Lion preparations were surveyed after the war by the German Naval Historical Department. These surveys, now available in the Bundesarchiv, show that the improvised invasion fleet consisted largely of river barges, tugboats, and converted fishing vessels. These craft were not designed for open water. They were slow. They were vulnerable to both weather and enemy action. Once across the Channel, the army would need to establish supply lines from these primitive landing craft across potentially hostile terrain. How would ammunition arrive? How would food be transported? Where would the fuel come from to keep trucks and tanks operational? Who would coordinate the flow of supplies once the beachhead began to expand? The British official history of the war, informed by post-war interrogations of German officers, now held at the National Archives under WO 208 series, captures the moment when this problem became apparent to German planners. General Adolf Strauss, who worked in the OKH logistics section, testified after the war that Sea Lion was never a serious military plan. It was, he said, a political gesture. Hitler needed to be seen as planning something aggressive against Britain. The military knew it was impossible, but no one could say so openly. The fundamental issue was this: Germany had conquered continental Europe with an army organized for rapid movement and concentrated force. Germany had no experience in amphibious operations. Germany had developed no specialized landing craft. Germany had created no coordinated doctrine for maintaining supply lines across water and into hostile territory. The Wehrmacht could move fast across open terrain when it had supply lines behind it. But those supply lines had to be built on land, connected to Germany by rail and road. Crossing water broke that system. By late August 1940, even Hitler had begun to accept the reality. Sea Lion was postponed. Indefinitely, Germany would seek victory through air power instead. The Luftwaffe would bomb Britain into surrender. The logistics of air campaigns seemed, at least theoretically, simpler. The Luftwaffe operated from bases on the continent. No water crossing required. No complicated invasion logistics necessary. Just bombs and more bombs, and the hope that Britain would eventually break. But the Luftwaffe faced its own logistical catastrophe, though no one yet understood how complete that catastrophe would be. German planners understood that Britain had an empire. What they could not truly comprehend was the scale and efficiency of that empire's logistical system. Australian wool arrived in British ports. South African gold underwrote British credit. New Zealand butter, Canadian beef, Indian cotton, all flowed toward the island nation. These were not abstract statistical quantities in German intelligence reports. They were real supplies, moving along established shipping routes, protected by the Royal Navy, increasingly supplemented by American production. We know the extent of this supply network from the Board of Trade Records and Ministry of Supply files held at the National Archives under BT11 and Avia series. These documents record, month by month, the quantities of materials arriving in British ports. The volumes are astonishing. In 1941 alone, Canada sent 1 million tons of wheat to Britain. Australia sent iron ore, copper and wool. South Africa sent gold and minerals. And underneath all of this flowed something Germany could never truly intercept: American industrial capacity. The Lend-Lease Agreement between Britain and the United States, formally ratified on March 11, 1941, fundamentally altered the war's trajectory. We know the terms from the official documentation held at the US National Archives under RG 169. The United States, while still officially neutral, began providing Britain with American-manufactured trucks, aircraft, weapons, and supplies at unprecedented scale. By 1942, American Lend-Lease shipments were exceeding 1 million tons per month. Germany had no equivalent source of external supply. Germany was dependent entirely on what could be extracted from conquered territories and what German industry could produce. Churchill's personal correspondence with Franklin Roosevelt, held at the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library in Hyde Park, New York, reveals the consciousness of this advantage. Churchill understood that he was fighting a war of industrial capacity, not a war of military tactics. Every conversation with Roosevelt circled back to the same theme: send more. Send more ships, more aircraft, more weapons, more food. And Roosevelt, driven by his own sense that American interests required a British victory, complied. The documents show an almost desperate intensity to these requests, but also a recognition that if the supplies did not arrive, Britain might fall. How we know this? The statistical analysis compiled in The Strategic Air Offensive Against Germany, produced by the United States Air Force Historical Division in 1961, breaks down the comparative industrial capacity of the Allied and Axis powers. Germany's annual production of strategic materials, petroleum, copper, tin, rubber, was constrained by the limits of European resources and German-controlled territories. Britain, through its empire and through American supply, had access to worldwide resources. Britain could import. Germany could not. By 1943, Germany was actually losing access to critical materials as the war progressed. The Axis supply of Southeast Asian rubber collapsed when Japan was driven from those territories. The loss of North Africa meant the loss of Mediterranean supply routes. Germany contracted, the Allies expanded. German generals saw Britain as an island, isolated and alone. They did not see the threads connecting Britain to Canada, Australia, South Africa, and the United States. They did not understand that the more the war progressed, the more those threads would thicken and multiply. By 1943, Britain was not just surviving on its own production. Britain was sustained by a global logistical network that Germany, as a continental power, could neither replicate nor effectively attack. Britain would not starve, because Britain was being fed by the entire English-speaking world. Operation Barbarossa began on June 22, 1941. The planning for this invasion is documented in the Quartermaster General records held at the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv. These documents show that the German logistics officers, competent men, educated men, knew that supplying an army of over 3 million men across the vastness of Russia would require unprecedented supply efforts. They calculated the daily tonnage required. They estimated the railway capacity needed. They projected the fuel consumption. And having done all of these calculations, they told Hitler what he needed to hear. The operation was logistically possible. It was not. How we know this? The Wehrmacht logistics studies, particularly Alexander Dallin's German military administration in Russia, based on extensive post-war interviews with German officers, show that the supply calculations for Barbarossa were fundamentally flawed. The primary problem was distance. The supply lines from Germany to the Russian front were staggering in length. Supplies had to travel from German factories across Europe, into Poland and Ukraine, and then forward to the front lines. The average distance was over 1,000 kilometers. German railways, while efficient, could not handle the volume required. The road network in Russia was primitive. Vehicles broke down. Fuel was consumed simply in the act of transportation itself. By December 1941, 6 months into the campaign, German armies around Moscow were already showing signs of supply collapse. The Quartermaster General's reports, examined in the post-war interrogations of German officers at the U.S. Army Military History Institute in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, document the grim arithmetic. The Wehrmacht needed approximately 20,000 tons of supplies per day to maintain its position. German logistics were delivering, on average, 15,000 tons per day. The shortfall grew worse as the front lines extended. By January 1942, as the temperature plummeted and supply vehicles froze on the roads, the Wehrmacht was receiving fewer than 12,000 tons per day. The result was starvation. Not metaphorical starvation, literal starvation. The captured German supply manifests held at the National Archives and Records Administration show that bread rations were cut repeatedly. Meat rations disappeared. Men were reduced to eating horse meat, then to eating the horses themselves when there was nothing else. The war diaries of individual German soldiers, private letters home, attest to the constant gnawing hunger. A soldier could not fight effectively when he had not eaten in 2 days. A soldier could not maintain equipment when his hands were so cold they would not function. A soldier could not advance when the trucks carrying ammunition and fuel were mired in mud or frozen in ice. The cruel irony that would have been apparent to any historian, though it was invisible to German generals in 1941, was this. The Germans had gone to war with Britain because they believed Britain's logistics were vulnerable to air attack and U-boat assault. They had failed to break British logistics, and now they had committed their entire army to an operation across supply lines so fragile that they began to collapse within months of the campaign's inception. By 1943, the Wehrmacht was openly cannibalizing supplies from rear areas to maintain frontline operations. The supply manifests show ammunition being diverted from garrison troops to combat units, fuel being stripped from logistics convoys to keep tanks operational for another day, officers making impossible choices about where to allocate scarce resources. The records of the German Quartermaster General's office show a man, Adolf Strauss, who had warned against Barbarossa in 1941, submitting report after report documenting the system's failure, making recommendation after recommendation that were ignored because there was no alternative. The operation could not be stopped. The supply lines could not be lengthened. The situation could only deteriorate. And deteriorate it did. By Stalingrad, by Kursk, by the time the Wehrmacht found itself in retreat across Ukraine and Poland, the supply system was not merely broken, It had ceased to function as anything other than a mechanism for managing collapse. Germany had gone to war believing it could defeat Britain through logistic superiority. It had ended that belief by discovering it could not even sustain its own logistics across a single continental front. The interrogation records are held at the National Archives in the United Kingdom under WO 208 series, and similar records exist at the US Army Military History Institute. What these records reveal is a pattern of remarkably consistent confession. Manstein did not say Germany lost because the Allies had better generals. He did not say Germany lost because the soldiers were braver or more skilled. He said Germany lost because the logistics were unsustainable. Manstein had spent years trying to compensate for logistical shortcomings through operational brilliance. He had conducted strategic retreats that preserved armies, when by any reasonable calculation, those armies should have been destroyed. But there were limits to what operational brilliance could accomplish. There was a point at which a supply system simply ceased to function, and after that point, no genius could restore what mathematics had taken away. How we know this? The post-war memoirs of German generals provide a collective confession. Manstein's Lost Victories, published in 1958, returns again and again to the theme of logistics failure. Kesselring's Memoirs, published in 1953, contains passages where the aging commander seems almost bewildered that the Luftwaffe, so superior in so many tactical respects, was ground down by the simple inability to replace aircraft as fast as they were being lost. These men were not making excuses. They were describing a reality that had taken years for them to truly comprehend. The interviews conducted by B.H. Liddell Hart, the British military historian, with captured German officers in 1946 and 1947, produced the German General's Talk, published in 1948. In these conversations, Hart, himself a military theorist, asked German officers a series of penetrating questions. Over and over, the officers returned to the same answer. We lost because we could not sustain the supply lines needed to wage war against an enemy with access to greater resources. It was not a matter of luck or circumstance, it was mathematics. Germany was never going to win a war of attrition. Germany's only hope had been a war of rapid movement and quick victory, and that hope had died in the summer of 1940 when the Luftwaffe failed to destroy the RAF, and in December 1941 when German armies bogged down outside Moscow. The US Strategic Bombing Survey, formerly titled The Effects of Strategic Bombing on the German War Economy, conducted after the war by a team of American economists and military analysts, examined the captured German records and reached a conclusion that has remained the consensus of historians ever since. Germany lost because its industrial capacity, even when combined with the resources of occupied territories, was fundamentally insufficient to wage a total war against an alliance that included the combined productive capacity of the British Empire, the Soviet Union, and the United States. It was not even close. By 1943, the Allies were outproducing Germany in virtually every category of military equipment by factors ranging from 3 to 1 to 10 to 1. The German generals understood this toward the end. They understood it because they could no longer hide from it. The supply manifests stopped lying. The production figures could not be faked. The shortages were real, physical, and lethal. One by one, these men who had shaped the war through their decisions came to recognize a single, terrible truth. They had been fighting a war that could not be won, and they had known it in some part of their minds since 1941 at the latest. They had simply not admitted it, even to themselves. The modern historical consensus, articulated across multiple major works beginning with Adam Tooze's The Wages of Destruction, published in 2006, is this. Germany lost World War II not because of a single decisive moment or a single failed strategy, but because Germany was fighting a war its economy could not sustain. This was not an opinion. This was a mathematical fact, verifiable through production statistics, resource analysis, and logistical calculations that any competent analyst in 1941 should have been able to perceive. How we know this? The comparative analysis of industrial capacity conducted by Richard Overy in Britain and the Defeat of Nazi Germany, published in 1997, breaks down the production numbers year by year. In 1941, the Allies outproduced Germany in military equipment by approximately 40%. By 1942, the gap had widened to 150%. By 1943, it was 300%. By 1944, it was effectively unlimited. Germany was not just losing the war. Germany was being overwhelmed by a quantitative disparity so vast that no tactical brilliance, no strategic innovation, no act of will could possibly overcome it. Yet there remains one genuine historical debate. Some scholars, following the arguments made by post-war German officers, suggest that Germany might have won if it had prioritized logistics differently. If the Kriegsmarine had been built to sustain commerce raiding and U-boat warfare exclusively. If the Wehrmacht had avoided Barbarossa and instead focused on securing North Africa and the Mediterranean. If German industrial capacity had been mobilized more efficiently earlier in the war. These are legitimate historical questions. They cannot be definitively answered because the counterfactuals are not testable. What can be definitively answered is this: Germany lost because logistics determines the limits of military power. A nation cannot project force beyond the reach of its supply lines. A supply line cannot be extended indefinitely. An army cannot be sustained on empty bellies and empty fuel tanks. These are not opinions. They are constraints that apply to all military action, in all historical periods. Germany discovered this fact in 1940, when the Luftwaffe could not maintain the attrition rate required to defeat the RAF. Germany confirmed it in 1942, when U-boats could not sink ships faster than the British could replace them. And Germany was utterly destroyed by it in 1943, when the Wehrmacht discovered that the roads of Russia would not sustain the armies fighting there. British generals, by contrast, organised their war effort around logistics. Churchill's constant refrain to Roosevelt was always about supplies. The British built convoy systems. The British organised their rationing to sustain civilian morale and defence production simultaneously. The British understood, perhaps because Britain was an island nation that had always depended on sea supply, that war was not primarily a matter of tactical genius. War was a matter of material. Whoever could deliver more material to the decisive point, whoever could sustain that material flow despite enemy disruption, whoever could replace losses faster than enemies could inflict them, that nation would win. The historical lesson here is not romantic. It does not celebrate human courage or sacrifice. It does not tell us that the righteous side won. It tells us something more fundamental and more troubling. It tells us that in industrial war, victory is largely determined before the shooting starts. Victory is determined by the comparative productive capacity of the combatants, by access to raw materials, by the efficiency of the supply chain, by the ability to sustain losses and replenish equipment. Tactics matter, strategy matters, individual leadership matters, but they matter at the margins. The center is logistics. German generals were not stupid men. Many were genuinely brilliant. But they were trained in a military tradition that emphasized operational and tactical excellence. They were not trained to think systemically about supply. They were not trained to understand that a war is not won by winning battles. A war is won by winning supply chains. And Britain's supply chains, fed by empire resources, supplemented by American production, protected by naval superiority and, later, air superiority, proved to be stronger, more resilient, and ultimately more important than anything the Wehrmacht could do. This is the final irony of the Second World War. Germany went to war believing it could overcome material disadvantage through military genius. Germany lost because mathematics cannot be defeated by genius. The supply line is not a romantic concept. It is not inspiring, but it is absolutely, completely, finally determinative of who wins wars and who does not. The Germans realized this truth too late. By the time they understood it, 6 million soldiers were dead. 70 million human beings had perished. Europe lay in ruins. And it was all because one nation thought it could fight a war its economy could not sustain, against enemies who had understood, from the very beginning, that wars are won in factories and supply depots, not on battlefields.